Family is supposed to be the one thing you can count on. Your wife, your kids, your brother-in-law, the men you grew up with, the friends who stood next to you at your wedding. These are the people who are supposed to be safe. But for the people in this story, family meant nothing. The man at the center of it killed his own wife's brother and went to the funeral. He killed his best friend, the man whose children called him uncle, and lied to the widow's face. He killed 19 people in total, walked out of prison in less than a year, and now sells his story for money on the internet. Hollywood has spent decades dressing up the mafia in slow-motion shots and Sinatra music. The truth is uglier than any film has ever shown. Today, we are covering the real life of Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. What you are about to hear is worse than Goodfellas, because every single word of it actually happened. Section 1. The Bensonhurst Boy Who Became the Bull. On a spring morning in 1955, a 10-year-old boy in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, walked outside and noticed his bicycle was gone. The bike had been a recent gift, and the boy was already known in the neighborhood for being short, stocky, and quick to use his fists. He started looking, and within a few hours he found his bike. Two older teenagers, both bigger than him, had taken it. The boy did not hesitate. He went straight at them, swinging both fists, ignoring the size difference, ignoring the fact that he was outnumbered. A small group of older men were watching the fight from a nearby cafe table. They were not random spectators. They were local mafia figures who spent their days at that corner. One of them stood up, walked over, broke up the fight, made the older boys give the bike back, and turned to his friends with a smile. As the boy walked away pushing his bicycle, that man said something that would follow the kid for the rest of his life. He said the little one fought like a bull. The nickname stuck immediately. By the next morning, every kid on the block knew him as Sammy the Bull. He was Salvatore Gravano, born March 12, 1945, the youngest child of Italian immigrants who had no idea their son had just been marked. Sammy's parents were not gangsters. His father, Giorlando, called Jerry, had jumped ship in Canada and entered the United States illegally, but once he settled in Brooklyn, he stayed out of trouble. He worked as a house painter until he developed lead poisoning from the paint, which forced him to switch careers. After that, he ran a small dress factory on 15th Avenue with Sammy's mother, Katerina, called Kay. She was a talented seamstress. They worked long hours, paid their bills, and tried to raise their son to be a normal kid. But Sammy struggled in school in a way no one understood at the time. He had dyslexia, a learning condition that makes reading and writing very difficult. In the 1950s, public schools in Brooklyn had no real way to help children like him. Teachers labeled him a slow learner. He was held back twice, once in 4th grade and once in 7th grade. The other kids made fun of him constantly, and Sammy's response was always the same. He used his fists. That pattern of violence as a substitute for words got him into more and more trouble. He punched school officials on at least 2 separate occasions. The school system gave up on him and sent him to what they called a 600 school, which was a special institution for kids labeled as troublemakers. Even that school eventually told his parents they could not keep him. Just before his 16th birthday, his parents had to sign him out of school for good. Jerry Gravano did everything he could think of to redirect his son. He made Sammy go to Mass. He talked to him about the value of honest work. He pointed out that the family business gave them a comfortable life. None of it stuck. Sammy was already drifting toward the only group that seemed to value him for what he was good at. And what he was good at was fighting. At 13, Sammy joined the Rampers, one of the most well-known street gangs in Bensonhurst. The Rampers were the unofficial farm team for the local mafia. The Profaci family, which later became the Colombo family, had been in Bensonhurst for decades, and many of the older men in the cafes had once been Rampers themselves. Sammy started small. He stole. He robbed local stores. He hijacked delivery trucks. He picked up jobs from older men who needed muscle. The mob figures who had named him noticed everything. They saw a kid who never backed down, who handled himself with his hands, and who never opened his mouth to the cops when he got picked up. Those three qualities were exactly what they were looking for. In 1964, the United States military drafted Sammy into the Army. He was sent to basic training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. After that, he was stationed in Indiana and then transferred to Fort Meade in Maryland, where he spent his time as a personal driver and bodyguard for a major. Most young men from his neighborhood would have seen the draft as an interruption. Sammy treated it as a business opportunity. He set up a loan sharking operation among the soldiers. He ran small gambling games. He collected a regular Army paycheck while running rackets on the side. When his 2 years were up in 1966, he was honorably discharged. Years later, looking back on the Vietnam War that was raging during those same years, Sammy said something that revealed exactly what kind of man he had already become. He said he would not have minded going to Vietnam. He said, in Vietnam, you got medals for killing people. When he returned to Bensonhurst, the path was already laid out. In 1968, his friend Tommy Spiro introduced him to Tommy's uncle, a man called Shorty Spiro, who was an associate of the Colombo crime family under the future boss, Carmine Persico. Shorty took one look at Sammy and saw what the men at the cafe had seen all those years before: a natural earner, a natural fighter, and a kid with no fear and no conscience getting in the way. Sammy started running with the Colombos almost immediately. Hijackings, robberies, loan sharking, card games in the back rooms of social clubs. Within 2 years, he would be asked to do something that would separate him from every other young hustler in Brooklyn. He would be asked to kill a man. That moment came in October of 1970, in the backseat of a car parked on a quiet street in Queens, with the radio playing a Beatles song. And the way Sammy described what happened in those few seconds would later send chills through every cop, prosecutor, and reporter who heard it. Section 2. The First Murder. Joseph Colucci, 1970. Joseph Colucci was a Colombo crime family associate in his 30s. He had a wife, a young son, and the same kind of life Sammy was building for himself. He worked under the same crew, the same boss, in the same neighborhood. He and Sammy were not enemies. They were not rivals. They were what mob people called friends of ours. Men who answered to the same captain and shared the same loyalty to Shorty Spiro. In a different version of this story, the two of them would have grown old together at the same cafe tables where the older men used to sit. But by the late summer of 1970, Joseph Colucci had become a problem that the Colombo family wanted to make disappear. And the man chosen to make him disappear was Sammy. The reason was a love affair. Tommy Spiro, the nephew of Shorty Spiro and one of Sammy's closest friends, had been sleeping with Joseph Colucci's wife. These things happened in the underworld more often than people realized, but they almost never ended quietly. Joseph found out. He was furious. He started telling people in the neighborhood that he was going to take care of the situation himself. He told them he was going to kill Tommy Spiro, Shorty Spiro, and Sammy, all three. In Mafia logic, once that threat was made, Joseph had signed his own death warrant. Killing without permission from your boss was forbidden, but the threat itself, made out loud, gave the Spiro side the right to ask permission first. They asked. Permission was granted. The job was given to a 25-year-old Sammy. There was nothing personal in it for Sammy. Joseph had not done anything to him. They had eaten in the same restaurants, sat at the same card games, traded the same jokes. But the rules of the world Sammy had chosen to enter were clear. When the boss said someone had to go, you did not ask why, and you did not say no. Sammy understood that this was the moment that would either make him or break him. If he did the job clean, he would be considered a serious man, the kind of associate who could be trusted with anything. If he flinched, his career was over before it started. The plan was simple. Sammy and another crew member named Ralph Spiro, a relative of Tommy and Shorty, set up a fake errand. They told Joseph they needed him for a small job that night. The three of them got into a car together. Sammy sat in the back. Joseph sat in the front passenger seat. Ralph drove. They drove around Queens for a while, making small talk, the way men in that life did, while Sammy waited for his moment. At some point during the drive, a Beatles song came on the radio. Sammy never said which one, only that it was a Beatles song, and that detail stuck with him for the rest of his life because of what happened next. He pulled out a handgun, raised it behind Joseph's head, and pulled the trigger. The way Sammy described that moment decades later is one of the most studied confessions in the history of organized crime in America. He said the rage he had been working up inside himself took over. He said everything seemed to slow down, like he was watching the scene from far away rather than living it. He said he could almost feel the bullet leaving the gun and entering Joseph's skull. He said he did not hear the first shot. He did not see any blood. Joseph's head did not even seem to move. He felt like he was a million miles away, like the whole thing was a dream he was watching someone else have. He compared it years later to the famous scene in The Godfather, where the young Michael Corleone shoots a corrupt police captain in a restaurant. The scene where Michael's eyes go glassy and the only sound is a train passing in the background. Sammy said that scene captured exactly how he felt. The world went quiet. He became someone new in those few seconds. He became a person who had ended another person's life. After the shooting, the two men got rid of the body and the car. They went back to Brooklyn and reported to Shorty Spiro that the job was done. Within a few hours, the news traveled up the chain of command of the Colombo family. Carmine Persico, who would later become the Colombo boss and was already one of the most feared men in New York, heard about the young kid from Bensonhurst who had handled the job without flinching. Sammy's stock went up overnight. He was no longer just a tough kid from a Brooklyn street gang. He was an earner with stones, a man who could be trusted to handle the most serious work the family had to offer. That reputation would follow him for the next 20 years. There is one more piece of the Joseph Colucci story that almost no one talks about, and it tells you everything you need to know about the world Sammy now lived in. Years later, when Sammy had moved up in the Mafia and become heavily involved in the New York concrete and construction business, he ended up in a partnership with a young man named Jack Colucci. Jack Colucci was the son of Joseph. He was the boy who had grown up without a father because of what Sammy had done in that car in 1970. Jack had no idea. He grew up hearing the same story everyone else heard, that his father had simply disappeared one night. He grew into adulthood, got into the construction trade, and ended up working with Sammy as a Gambino associate. Sammy mentored him. Sammy gave him work. Sammy stood next to the son of the man he had killed and built a business with him, and never said a word. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That kind of cold quiet was what made Sammy different from almost every other young gangster of his era. The Colombo family saw it. The Gambino family was about to see it too. And within a few years of the Joseph Colucci killing, Sammy would be transferred to a new family entirely, where his real career as a hitman would begin under the shadow of one of the most powerful bosses in the country. Section 3. The Brother-in-Law, Nicholas Schibetta, 1978. In 1971, Sammy married a young woman from the neighborhood named Deborah Schibetta. Deborah was from a hard-working Italian family in Bensonhurst. Her father was an electrical engineer who worked the night shift for the phone company, putting together circuit boards. Her mother was a homemaker. Deborah had a younger brother named Nicholas, but everyone called him Little Nicky. Nicky was 22 when the events of 1978 took place, And he was the kind of kid who could have gone either way in life. He had grown up watching the men in the neighborhood and the way they carried themselves, and he wanted what they had. The cars, the clothes, the respect, the free meals at the best restaurants in Brooklyn. By his early 20s, he was floating around the edges of the Gambino crime family as an associate, picking up small jobs, trying to make a name for himself. The problem was that little Nicky did not have the discipline for the life he wanted. He had a serious cocaine habit. He had a drinking problem. He spent money faster than he could earn it, picking up restaurant tabs for entire tables, handing out huge tips to waiters, ordering champagne and steak at the Copacabana like he was already a made man. He never saved a dollar. He borrowed from loan sharks all over Brooklyn, and he started using his brother-in-law's name to get those loans. That was a serious problem, because if Nicky did not pay back the money, the loan sharks would come to Sammy expecting him to cover it. Sammy was building a reputation as a serious earner in the Gambino family, and his brother-in-law was making him look bad. Nicky also had a habit of getting into fights at the wrong places with the wrong people. He got into a brawl in a nightclub owned by a Gambino associate. He got into another fight with the son of another connected man and called the police on him afterward, which in the world of the Mafia was an unforgivable insult. Worst of all, he made a mistake that sealed his fate. He insulted a female relative of Frank DeCicco. DeCicco was one of the most respected captains in the Gambino family, a man who would later help Sammy and John Gotti pull off the most famous mob hit in American history. You did not insult a DeCicco woman and walk away. The wheels started turning. In 1978, the boss of the Gambino family was Paul Castellano. He was the brother-in-law of the late Carlo Gambino, and he had inherited the family after Carlo died in 1976. Castellano was a businessman more than a street guy, but he understood discipline, and he understood that little Nicky had become a liability. Castellano gave the order. Nicky had to go. But Castellano knew there was a complication, because Nicky was Sammy's brother-in-law, and Sammy was now a rising figure in the family. Castellano gave the contract to Frank DeCicco and told him specifically not to tell Sammy. The plan was for the killing to happen and for Sammy to find out only after the fact. DeCicco assigned the actual job to two men on Sammy's own crew, his best friend Louis Melito and an associate named Joseph D'Angelo. The three of them, DeCicco, Melito, and D'Angelo, talked it over among themselves. All three of them agreed that doing the job behind Sammy's back was wrong. It violated something deeper than a mafia rule. It violated the basic understanding that men who worked together did not go behind each other's backs to harm each other's families. DeCicco went back to Castellano and pushed him to let Sammy know what was about to happen. Castellano agreed, but with a chilling condition. He told DeCicco that if Sammy refused to accept the order, DeCicco was to kill Sammy too. DeCicco delivered the news to Sammy in person. Sammy's first reaction was rage. He told DeCicco he was going to kill Castellano himself before he let anyone touch his wife's brother. DeCicco let him talk. Then DeCicco said something that brought Sammy back to reality. He told Sammy that going to war with the boss of the Gambino family was a guaranteed death sentence. He told Sammy that Castellano had hundreds of made men behind him, and that Sammy and his small crew would be eliminated within days. He told Sammy that the only way to survive was to accept it. Sammy went quiet. He thought about it, and then he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Years later, Sammy described that moment in his own words. He said he chose against Nicky. He said he had taken an oath that Cosa Nostra came before everything, including blood family, and he was going to honor that oath. What happened next was carried out by Sammy's own crew. Nicky was lured somewhere in Brooklyn and killed. The body was then dismembered and disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be recovered. The only piece of Nicky that was ever found was one of his hands. There are conflicting accounts of how the hand turned up. One version says it was discovered by the family dog and brought back to the Schibetta family home. What is not in dispute is that there was a funeral. There was a casket, and inside that casket, the only thing the family had left to bury was that single hand. Sammy attended the funeral. He stood next to his wife, Deborah, who had no idea what had really happened. He played the part of the grieving brother-in-law. He buried the hand of the boy whose murder he had personally signed off on. Nicky was officially declared legally dead in 1985, 7 years after he was killed. Deborah Shibeta did not learn the truth about her husband's role in her brother's death until the early 1990s, more than a decade after Nicky was killed. By then, Sammy was already on his way to becoming the most famous turncoat in the history of the American Mafia. But before that day came, he still had a long way to climb, and one of the most ruthless killings of his entire career was just 3 years away, inside a flashy disco he himself had built into one of the hottest clubs in Brooklyn. Section 4. The Frank Fiala Killing, 1982. By the early 1980s, Sammy was no longer just a crew member. He was a serious player in the Gambino family. He had moved on from low-level street work and built himself into a real businessman with mob backing. He owned construction companies. He had drywall contracts all over New York. And in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn, he ran a discotheque called the Plaza Suite. The Plaza Suite was not some small neighborhood lounge. It was one of the most popular nightclubs in Brooklyn at the time. People waited in line for an hour to get in. Live performers like Chubby Checker and the Four Tops appeared on the stage. The cash poured in every weekend. Sammy made about $4,000 a week from that one club alone, which was serious money in 1982. The club was also his unofficial headquarters, the place where he ran his construction business and met with his crew. In 1982, a man named Frank Fiala walked into Sammy's life and changed everything. Fiala was a wealthy businessman originally from Czechoslovakia. He had made a fortune in the drug trade, dealing in large quantities, and he had cash he needed to spend. He was also what people in the underworld called a wannabe. He admired the Mafia. He wanted to live the life. He wanted the respect. And he had the kind of money that made him think he could buy his way into it. Fiala approached Sammy and paid him $40,000 in cash just to rent the Plaza Suite for one night so he could throw himself a birthday party. Sammy took the money. The party happened. 2 days later, Fiala came back with a much bigger offer. He told Sammy he wanted to buy the club outright. He offered $1 million. The Plaza Suite was worth about $200,000. Fiala was offering 5 times that. Sammy could not believe his luck. The deal was structured the way these underworld deals usually were. There would be $100,000 in cash up front as a down payment. There would be $650,000 in gold bullion handed over under the table, off the books, away from the eyes of the IRS. And there would be a final $250,000 at the official closing. Sammy agreed. The papers started moving. The down payment was made. As far as Sammy was concerned, he was about to walk away with a fortune and move on to bigger things. The problem started almost immediately. Frank Fiala did not understand the rules. He did not understand that until the deal was officially closed, the club still belonged to Sammy. He moved in like he already owned the place. He started giving orders to Sammy's staff. He hired his own bouncers. He started a renovation project without asking. He set up his own personal office inside the building. And then he made the move that pushed Sammy past the breaking point. He decided he wanted a bigger office, so he started knocking through one of the office walls with a sledgehammer. The wall he was breaking through was the wall to Sammy's private office, the office Sammy had used for years to run his crew and his business. When Sammy walked in and confronted him, Fiala did not back down. He pulled out a fully automatic firearm and pointed it directly at Sammy. Sammy did something that very few men in his position would have done. He stayed calm. He talked Fiala down. He acted like the whole thing was a misunderstanding. He smiled. He shook hands. He walked out of the building like nothing had happened. But the moment Sammy was on the street, his decision had already been made. Frank Fiala was going to die that night. Sammy called his brother-in-law Eddie Garafola and told him to round up the crew. The men he gathered were the most trusted killers in his circle. His best friend, Louis Melito, Joseph D'Angelo, the same crew member who had handled the Sabetta job, a young man named Nicholas Mormondo, known as Nicky Cowboy, a man named Michael DeBatt, who had grown up in the neighborhood, and a few others. They positioned themselves outside the club and waited. Later that same night, Frank Fiala walked out of the Plaza suite, surrounded by his entourage. He was relaxed. He thought he had won the standoff in the office. He thought Sammy had backed down. As Fiala stepped into the street, Sammy walked right up to him through the crowd, casual and friendly, like an old buddy saying hello. Sammy smiled at him and said, "Hey Frank, how you doing?" Fiala turned to face him, surprised. In that exact moment, Louis Melito came up from behind Fiala and ended his life with a single shot to the back of the head. Fiala dropped to the pavement. Melito then stood directly over the body and fired 2 more shots, one into each of Fiala's eyes. It was a deliberate message to anyone who saw it. This is what happens when you disrespect us. Sammy walked over to the body in front of dozens of horrified witnesses, looked down at it, and spat on it. Then the entire crew vanished into the streets of Brooklyn. The killing was unsanctioned. Sammy had not asked Paul Castellano for permission, and that was a major violation of the rules. Castellano was furious when he heard about it. He summoned Sammy and Melito to a meeting at a Manhattan restaurant. Sammy went into that meeting fully prepared to be killed. He had already gathered his crew and told them that if Castellano gave the order, they were going to fight back. But Sammy had also prepared a smart story. He told Castellano he had not asked for permission because he wanted to protect the boss in case the hit went wrong. Castellano accepted the explanation. Sammy walked out alive. There was one more problem to deal with, though, because the publicity around the murder caught the attention of the IRS. They started digging into the books of the Plaza suite. Sammy ended up charged with tax evasion. He hired a sharp lawyer named Gerald Shargell to represent him, and at trial, Sammy was acquitted. He got away with all of it. He also paid a $5,000 bribe to a New York City homicide detective named Louis Eppolito to make sure the murder investigation went nowhere, and it never did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the time the dust settled, Sammy had killed a man in front of a crowd, mutilated the body in the street, talked his way out of execution by his own boss, beaten the IRS, and bribed a cop. He was untouchable. And in just 3 more years, he would help plan a hit so bold and so public that it would change the entire structure of organized crime in America forever. Section 5. Sparks Steakhouse, December 16, 1985. By the middle of the 1980s, the Gambino crime family was the most powerful organization of its kind in the United States. The boss was Paul Castellano, a tall, quiet 60-something man who lived in a giant white mansion on Staten Island that everyone called the White House. Castellano was not a street guy. He was a businessman. He preferred construction contracts, meat distribution, and trucking deals over the old-fashioned hijackings and shakedowns that built the family. He rarely came down from his mansion. He communicated with his men through his underboss, an old-school figure named Agnello Della Croce, who ran the street side of the family from a social club in Manhattan. The arrangement worked for years. The street guys reported to Della Croce. Della Croce reported to Castellano. Everyone stayed in their lane. One of the most ambitious men reporting to Della Croce was a 44-year-old captain named John Gotti. Gotti was loud, charismatic, well-dressed, and hungry for more power than he had. He ran a crew out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens. He made a lot of money for the family, but he and Castellano did not get along. Castellano had two big problems with Gotti. First, Gotti's crew, especially Gotti's right-hand man, Angelo Ruggiero, had been caught on FBI tape talking openly about heroin trafficking. Castellano had banned heroin work because anyone caught dealing it faced massive federal prison time.
Second, Castellano was facing a major federal racketeering trial, and he was worried that those tapes could destroy his case. He demanded the tapes from Gotti and Ruggiero, and they refused to hand them over. Then, in late 1985, two events happened back-to-back that pushed everything to the edge. On December 2, 1985, Aniello Della Croce died of cancer. He had been the only thing standing between Gotti and Castellano for years. With Della Croce gone, Castellano did not even attend the wake. To the men in Gotti's circle, that was a personal insult. Then, Castellano made his next move. He named his personal driver and bodyguard, a tough but unsophisticated man named Thomas Bilotti, as the new underboss. Word also got back to Gotti that Castellano was planning to break up Gotti's crew entirely. Gotti decided he had two choices. He could wait to be demoted or killed, or he could move first. He started building a small group of conspirators. Sammy was at the center of it. So was Frank DeCicco, the captain who had a long history with both sides.
So was Angelo Ruggiero. So was an old, respected figure named Joseph Armone, called Joe Piney. The group spent weeks meeting in secret, working through the plan. They knew the rule. Killing a boss without permission from the heads of the other 4 crime families was forbidden. But they also knew there was no time to ask for that permission. They had to do it fast, and they had to do it in a way that nobody could survive. The opportunity came on December 16, 1985. Frank DeCicco passed along the information that Castellano had a meeting set for that night at Sparks Steakhouse, a high-end restaurant on East 46th Street in Manhattan. Bilotti would be driving him. Several other Gambino captains were also expected. Gotti and Sammy made the final call. The hit would happen right outside the restaurant. The plan came together quickly. The shooters were Salvatore Scala, Vincent Artuso, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia. They were dressed in identical long trench coats and Russian-style fur hats, so witnesses would only remember the costume, not the faces. They positioned themselves near the entrance of the restaurant. Backup shooters were placed down the street. Gotti and Sammy parked across the intersection at 46th and 3rd Avenue in a Lincoln with dark-tinted windows. Sammy held a walkie-talkie. The whole operation was timed to the second. At one point, Castellano's car actually pulled up next to Gotti and Sammy at a red light. Bilotti was driving. Castellano was in the passenger seat. They sat there a few feet apart from the men who were about to kill them, but the tinted windows of the Lincoln made it impossible to see inside. The light turned green. Castellano's car kept going toward the restaurant. Sammy clicked the walkie-talkie and told the shooters that Big Paul was on his way.
At about 5:26 in the evening, in the middle of Christmas shopping season, Castellano's Lincoln pulled up in front of Sparks. Hundreds of regular New Yorkers were on the sidewalks, office workers heading home, tourists with shopping bags, off-duty police officers. Castellano stepped out of the passenger side. The 4 shooters moved on him from the front of the restaurant in perfect formation. They opened fire. Castellano was hit 6 times. Bilotti, stepping out of the driver's side, tried to react but never got the chance. He was hit 4 times, including the final round to the head. The whole thing took less than 10 seconds. The shooters walked, did not run, away from the scene and disappeared into the crowd in different directions.
Gotti and Sammy did not leave right away. Gotti put the Lincoln in drive and slowly rolled past the bodies on the sidewalk to make absolutely sure both men were dead. He looked. He saw what he needed to see.
Then he turned south on 2nd Avenue and headed back to Brooklyn. Within hours, the news was on every television station in the country. The boss of the most powerful crime family in America had been gunned down on a Manhattan sidewalk in front of hundreds of witnesses. 2 weeks later, on January 15, 1986, 20 Gambino captains gathered at a meeting and formally accepted John Gotti as their new boss. Sammy was promoted to captain. The Catholic Archdiocese of New York refused to allow Castellano a Catholic funeral, citing the way he had lived and the way he had died. The Sparks hit changed everything. Gotti became a household name almost overnight. The press started calling him the Dapper Don because of his expensive suits, and then the Teflon Don because no charges seemed to stick to him. But behind the scenes, Sammy was the engine. He was the planner, the negotiator, the closer. And as Gotti's fame grew bigger and his ego grew with it, the loyalty between the two men was about to be tested in a way neither of them saw coming, starting with a phone call that would force Sammy to decide whether to end the life of the man he loved most in the world. Section 6. The Best Friend, Louis Melito, 1988. If you had asked anyone in the Gambino family in the 1980s who Sammy was closest to, the answer would have been the same every single time: Louis Melito. They were not just friends, they were brothers in everything but blood. They had grown up together in Brooklyn. They had committed their first crimes together. They had been side by side during the Frank Fiala killing. Louis was the shooter on more than one of Sammy's biggest jobs. When Sammy was a young hustler trying to climb, Louis was right there with him. When Sammy got promoted, he made sure Louis got promoted too.
Sammy personally helped get Louis made into the Gambino family in the early 1980s, which was the highest honor a man in that world could receive. They started a construction business together. They went on family vacations together.
Louis's wife Linda and his children treated Sammy like a member of their family. The Melito kids called Sammy by a nickname most kids reserved for their favorite uncle. They called him Uncle Sammy. Their bond was so deep that for years it seemed like nothing could break it. They survived gang wars, FBI investigations, and changes in leadership at the very top of the family. They watched bosses come and go. They watched friends get killed. Through all of it, Louis was the one person Sammy trusted without question. In a life built on lies and double crosses, Louis was the closest thing Sammy had to family that was not actually family. The trouble started after the Sparks Steakhouse hit, when John Gotti took over as boss and the entire culture of the Gambino family changed almost overnight. Under Castellano, the family had been quiet, businesslike, and careful. Under Gotti, it became loud, flashy, and reckless. Gotti loved attention. He loved the cameras. He loved being recognized when he walked into restaurants. A lot of the older, more traditional members of the family hated this. They believed a real mafia boss was supposed to be invisible, not famous. Louis Melito was one of those traditionalists. He had grown up in the old way, where you kept your head down, made your money quietly, and never gave the FBI a reason to point a camera at you. Watching Gotti turn the family into a tabloid story made Louis sick. Louis was not the kind of man who could keep his mouth shut about it. He started complaining. He complained to other made men. He complained at social clubs. He criticized Gotti's leadership openly. He said Gotti was bringing heat down on the entire family, that the new boss cared more about magazine covers than about protecting his men. In the Mafia, that kind of talk is incredibly dangerous because eventually it gets back to the boss. And it did.
By early 1988, Gotti knew exactly what Louis was saying. He decided Louis had to go. Gotti gave the order to Sammy. There was no debate. Sammy was now the underboss in everything but title, and when the boss said someone had to be eliminated, the underboss made it happen. The fact that the target was Sammy's best friend made no difference in the world they lived in. The rules were the rules. In March of 1988, Louis was lured to a Brooklyn social club for what he thought was a normal sit-down. He walked in expecting to talk business. He was shot to death inside that club. The body was disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be recovered. Louis Milito simply disappeared. There was no funeral. There was no body for his wife and children to bury. There was nothing. Linda Milito waited for hours, then for days. When her husband did not come home and did not call, she went looking. She eventually showed up at Sammy's house in tears, asking what had happened, asking if Sammy knew anything. Sammy looked her in the face. He handed her $5,000 in cash. He told her he did not know where Louis was, and then he cut off all contact with her and the children. The kids who used to call him Uncle Sammy never saw him again. A short time later, a friend of Linda's spotted Sammy driving Louis's car, a Lincoln. The friend recognized it because of some specific damage to the vehicle that had happened before Louis disappeared. There was no doubt Sammy had killed his best friend, taken his car, and lied to his widow's face. Years later, in 1997, Sammy sat down for an interview with the journalist Diane Sawyer on national television. She asked him about Louis. For just a moment, the cold mask slipped. Sammy admitted that the Milito killing had hurt him. He said it tore him up. He said he knew the wife and the children, and that the whole thing killed him inside. Even years after the fact, even sitting in a comfortable studio with no danger in front of him, he could not pretend the murder had been just another job. Linda Milito later wrote a book of her own called Mafia Wife. In it, she made an explosive claim. She said a Gambino source had told her something that contradicted the official version of the killing. Sammy had testified in court that he had only been a bystander when Louis was shot, that someone else had pulled the trigger. According to Linda's source, that was a lie.
The source told her that Sammy himself had shot Louis twice in the back of the head and once under the chin. To this day, the truth of who actually pulled the trigger remains contested between Sammy's testimony and Linda's claim. What is not contested is that Sammy gave the order, set up the meeting, walked his best friend into a room he was never going to walk out of, and then went home to his wife and kids and lived his life like nothing had happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Louis Milito killing was the moment Sammy crossed a line he could never come back from. He had killed for revenge before. He had killed for business. He had killed for the boss. But this was different. This was the man who knew his children's birthdays, who had stood next to him at his wedding, who had bled with him in the streets of Brooklyn for 20 years. While the men around Sammy were committing one act of betrayal after another, the empire he had been quietly building outside of all this killing was about to make him one of the richest mob figures in American history, controlling an industry that touched almost every block in New York City. Section 7. The Concrete Kingdom. How Sammy made $20 million a year. Most people who think about the Mafia picture men in dark suits running gambling operations and loan sharking rings out of back rooms. That kind of work existed, and Sammy did plenty of it. But the real money in the New York Mafia in the 1980s was not in the streets. It was in the buildings going up all over the city. Every skyscraper, every new apartment tower, every road and bridge being built in New York during that decade had Mafia fingerprints on it somewhere. And Sammy was not just a small player in that world.
He was one of the men running it. The way it worked was simple but brilliant. New York City needed concrete to build anything. Concrete is the foundation of every modern building. Without it, the city does not grow. 4 of the 5 major crime families in New York, the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families, had quietly taken control of the concrete business decades earlier. They worked together as a group that law enforcement later called the Concrete Club. The arrangement was straightforward. Any construction job in New York City worth more than $2 million had to use one of the concrete companies that the families approved. The contractors who needed the concrete had to pay a tax of 2% of the total value of the job to the Mafia. If a contractor tried to go around the system and use an outside company, the unions would shut his job down. Workers would not show up. Trucks would not deliver. The job would die. So the contractors paid. They had no choice. Sammy was deep inside this entire system. He partnered with his brother-in-law, Eddie Garafola, in a drywall and plumbing business that grew into one of the busiest in the city. He moved into the concrete paving side of things, which was just as profitable. He had connections to the corrupt officials at Teamsters Local 282, the union that controlled the truck drivers who actually delivered the concrete to the building sites. By controlling the union, the family controlled the deliveries. By controlling the deliveries, they controlled which contractors could work and which could not. There is one detail about Sammy's concrete business that almost sounds made up, but it is true. One of the very first concrete companies he partnered with was run by a man named Jack Colucci. Jack was the son of Joseph Colucci, the man Sammy had killed in that car back in 1970, the very first murder of his career. Jack had no idea that the man helping him run his business was the same man who had ended his father's life.
Sammy stood next to him, did business with him, made money with him, and never said a word. After the Castellano hit and the rise of John Gotti, Sammy's earnings exploded. As the right-hand man to the most famous mafia boss in America, he had access to every major racket the family controlled. There was a regular cash payment that came in every month from Castellano's own son, Philip, who ran a Staten Island concrete company called Scaramix. After Castellano was killed, the company was forced to pay tribute to the men who had killed his father. The payment was $3 per cubic yard of concrete, which came out to about $25,000 every month. 80% of that money went directly to John Gotti and Sammy. The rest went to the corrupt union officials. Add up everything Sammy was bringing in during the late 1980s: the construction businesses, the drywall contracts, the concrete kickbacks, the union extortion, the piece of every major job in the city, the loan sharking, the illegal gambling, the Plaza Suite Club. According to FBI estimates, Sammy was earning somewhere between $5 million and $20 million every single year at his peak. He bought a 30-acre farm in rural New Jersey in a place called Cream Ridge. He bought trotting horses and raced them at the Meadowlands. He paid for everything in cash. He had a personal trainer. He had a tailor. He had restaurants in every neighborhood that gave him the best table without asking. Years later, in a 1998 interview, Sammy summed up his power in one short sentence. He said he literally controlled Manhattan. That kind of money and power should have been enough for any man to retire on. He had everything most people in the world will never have. He had a beautiful family, a successful empire, and the trust of the most famous boss in America.
But he was about to lose all of it. Not because of a rival mobster, not because of a federal investigation that he could not beat, but because of a single recording made inside a small apartment in Little Italy where John Gotti said something about Sammy that Sammy was never supposed to hear. Section 8. The tapes that broke the bull. Why Sammy flipped.
For almost 40 years, the FBI had been chasing the heads of the 5 families. And for almost 40 years, the bosses had stayed one step ahead. The reason was simple. The bosses never wrote anything down, and they never said anything important on the phone. They communicated face-to-face, in social clubs, on street corners, in the back rooms of restaurants. If the FBI wanted to record them, the FBI had to find a way to plant a hidden microphone in a place where the bosses thought they were safe. With John Gotti, that place was the Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy. The Ravenite was Gotti's headquarters. It was where he held court every day. He believed it was secure. He was wrong. Starting in November of 1989, the FBI did something Gotti never expected. They got into the building. But they did not just plant a microphone in the main club room, where Gotti might have been careful. They planted microphones in 3 places. They put one in the main room, one in the hallway downstairs, and most importantly, one in a small apartment directly above the club. That apartment belonged to the elderly widow of a former Gambino soldier. Gotti had started using it as his real meeting room because he was sure no one would ever bug an old woman's apartment. He held his most private conversations up there, with Sammy and with the acting consigliere, a man named Frank Locascio, called Frankie Locke. The FBI listened to everything for over a year. Gotti had no idea. On December 11, 1990, the FBI raided the Ravenite. They arrested John Gotti, Sammy, Frank Locascio, and Thomas Gambino. The 4 men were charged with racketeering, multiple counts of murder, gambling, loan sharking, obstruction of justice, and bribery. The charges were stacked so high that there was no realistic chance any of them would ever see freedom again. They were held without bail at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan. The trial was set for early 1992. The lawyers for the defense started preparing what is called a common defense. The idea was that all 4 men would stick together, all use the same legal strategy, and all stay loyal until the end.
Gotti's lawyers, Bruce Cutler and later Albert Krieger, were running the show. Sammy went along with it because that was what loyalty looked like in the Mafia. You did not break ranks. You did not save yourself at the expense of your boss. You took the hit together. Then in early 1991, the prosecutors did something that changed the entire game. They began playing the Ravenite tapes in court during pretrial hearings, with the defendants sitting right there. For the first time, Sammy heard with his own ears what John Gotti had been saying about him in private. The recordings stretched back to 1989 and 1990. On those tapes, Gotti was not the loyal boss Sammy thought he had been working for. Gotti was a man building a case against his own underboss. Over and over again, Gotti complained to Frank Locascio that Sammy was too greedy, that Sammy was trying to take over too many businesses, that Sammy was making moves without permission. Worse than that, Gotti was rewriting the history of 3 specific killings: the murders of Robert DiBernardo, Louis Melito, and Louis De Bono. On the tapes, Gotti was making it sound like Sammy had been the one pushing for those killings, that Sammy had manipulated him into approving them, that Sammy was the real force behind the bodies. Sammy understood instantly what was happening. Gotti was preparing to throw him under the bus. If the trial went badly, Gotti and his lawyers were going to argue that Sammy was the real killer, that Sammy was the one who had built up power behind Gotti's back, that Sammy was the one the jury should focus on. Sammy was being set up as the fall guy. There was one tape that pushed him over the edge. On a recording from December 12, 1989, Gotti was heard saying that he was still the boss, that even if he got 50 years,
When he was in the can, Sammy would be in charge. On the surface, that sounded loyal, but in context with everything else Gotti had said, it was a setup. Gotti was building a record of Sammy as the real power. Sammy realized he was looking at the rest of his life in a federal prison cell, while the boss he had bled for tried to save himself.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In late October of 1991, Sammy made his decision. He could not approach the FBI directly without other inmates noticing. So he did something that broke one of the deepest rules in the Mafia. He used his wife as the messenger. And the moment that message reached the FBI, the most powerful organized crime trial in American history was over before it even started. Section 9. The Sweetheart Deal. 19 murders, 5 years. On the night of November 8, 1991, around 1 in the morning, FBI agents quietly walked into the federal prison in Otisville, New York. They removed Sammy from his cell and drove him to a motel in a suburb just outside New York City. Across a small table, Sammy and the prosecutors started bargaining. The deal they worked out shocked even the agents in the room. Sammy would plead guilty to a single count of racketeering. He would tell the government everything he knew about every crime he had ever committed and every member of the Mafia he had ever known. In exchange, he would face a maximum of 20 years in federal prison, with the actual sentence to be decided later by the judge based on how useful his testimony turned out to be. On November 13, 1991, Sammy formally signed the cooperation agreement. He became the first member of the leadership of a New York crime family in history to ever turn government witness. The trial began on February 12, 1992, in federal court in Brooklyn, in front of Judge Leo Glasser. The jury was anonymous and fully sequestered, which had never been done before in a Brooklyn federal trial. The reason was Gotti's reputation for getting to jurors. Sammy took the witness stand on March 2, 1992. He stayed up there for 9 straight days. The lead prosecutor, John Gleason, walked him through every part of the Gambino family structure. Sammy identified Gotti as the boss. He identified Frank Locascio as the consigliere. He identified himself as the underboss. Then he started naming the murders. He confessed to 19 of them on the stand. He named the victims one by one. Joseph Colucci in 1970. Alan Kaiser, a 16-year-old killed in 1977 because he looked like someone else. Nicholas Sciabetta, his brother-in-law, in 1978. John Simone in 1980. Frank Stilatano in 1981. Frank Fiala in 1982. A man known only as Jackie in 1983. Thomas Bilotti and Paul Castellano in 1985. Nicky Mormondo and Robert DiBernardo in 1986. Michael DeBatt in 1987. Louis Melito in 1988. Thomas Spinelli in 1989. Edward Garofalo and Louis DeBono in 1990. Of those 19, he tied Gotti directly to 4. The defense lawyers, Albert Krieger for Gotti and Anthony Cardinale for Locascio, hammered him for days during cross-examination. They could not break him. Sammy answered every question calmly, never lost his temper, and never contradicted himself in any meaningful way. At one point during the testimony, Gotti turned to reporters and called Sammy a junkie, claiming Sammy had used illegal muscle-building drugs. He even mimed pushing a needle into his own arm in the courtroom. None of it changed what was happening on the stand. On April 2, 1992, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on all 13 counts of racketeering and murder. On June 23, 1992, Judge Glasser sentenced John Gotti and Frank Locascio to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole.
The Teflon Don was finished. He surrendered to begin serving his sentence on December 14, 1992. He would die in a federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri, in June of 2002 from cancer. Sammy waited 2 more years to be sentenced. He spent that time helping the government build cases against more than 24 other men. By the time he stood in front of Judge Glasser for his own sentencing on September 26, 1994, federal prosecutors stood up and asked the judge to be lenient. They told the court that Sammy's cooperation had already produced 37 convictions. 9 more cases were waiting to go to trial. 8 corrupt union officials had resigned because of him. He had testified against Genovese boss Vincent Gigante. He had testified against Colombo acting boss Vic Orena. In total, he had given the FBI information on 29 made men, including current and former captains of multiple families. The judge listened. He looked at Sammy, and he sentenced him to 5 years in prison. Because Sammy had already been in custody for almost 4 years waiting to testify, the actual time he had left to serve was less than 1 year. For the families of the 19 people Sammy had killed, that sentence was the second tragedy. Laura Garofalo, whose father Eddie was killed by Sammy in 1990, said it best in an interview years later. She said, "Most people do more time for 1 murder. Sammy had done 19. She said the government had wrapped him in the American flag and sent him off. The phrase haunted everyone who heard it. 19 lives had ended. 19 families had been destroyed, and the man responsible was about to walk out of federal prison a free man, with a new identity and a new face waiting for him. What he did with that fresh start would prove that whatever the prosecutors thought they were buying when they made that deal, they had bought a lie." Section 10. Arizona Implosion and the Podcast Era. In 1995, less than a year after his sentencing, Sammy walked out of federal custody. The government placed him in the Witness Protection Program. They gave him a new name, Jimmy Moran. They moved him and his family to a quiet location in Colorado. They offered him a chance most criminals never get, the chance to disappear and live a normal life. He lasted 8 months. Sammy hated it. He could not stand pretending to be someone else. He could not stand the rules. He could not stand having to ask permission to make a phone call or visit a relative. So he walked away from the program voluntarily and moved his family to the Phoenix area in Arizona. He had plastic surgery to change his appearance. He started 2 companies, a swimming pool installation business called Creative Pools and a construction company called Marathon Development. On paper, he looked like a quiet, middle-aged businessman with a slight Brooklyn accent. That was not the truth. Sammy did not actually try to hide. He started showing up regularly at a local coffee shop in Tempe called Gold Bar Espresso. The staff there figured out who he was almost immediately. Whenever Sammy walked in, one of the employees would run to the piano in the entryway and play the theme music from The Godfather. Sammy would sit at his favorite table with his back to the wall, surrounded by young fans who were thrilled to meet a real-life mob figure. He told stories about the murders he had committed. He played chess. He drank double espressos. He signed copies of his book, Underboss, which he had co-written with the journalist Peter Moss in 1996. The book sold over 1 million copies. He even sat down for a major television interview with Diane Sawyer in 1997 and openly bragged that he was a hero. By the late 1990s, the boredom of normal life had completely worn through. Sammy started looking for action again. His son Gerard had become friends with a young man named Michael Papa, who ran a small operation selling a party drug called ecstasy at raves and dance clubs around Phoenix. Papa was also a leader of a local violent gang of mostly white teenagers from middle-class homes called the Devil Dogs. Sammy saw an opportunity. He stepped in and started financing the operation. With his money and his connections, what had been a small ring became the largest distributor of that drug in the entire state of Arizona. They were moving 25,000 to 30,000 pills every single week. The operation was bringing in roughly $500,000 a week in profit. It all collapsed on the morning of February 24, 2000. At 6 in the morning, Phoenix police, state troopers, and federal agents launched a coordinated raid across the Phoenix metropolitan area. They arrested 40 people. Sammy was one of them. So was his wife, Deborah. So was his daughter, Karen. So was his son, Gerard. The Arizona Attorney General at the time, Janet Napolitano,
Called it one of the largest and most successful operations in the state's history. In a jailhouse interview a short time later, Sammy summed up his own decision to get involved with one short sentence. He said he had been stupid. In 2001, Sammy pleaded guilty to federal and state charges. In 2002, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison in New York and 19 years in state prison in Arizona, with the sentences running at the same time. He was also given a $100,000 fine and lifetime supervised release for the rest of his life. Around the same time, doctors diagnosed him with a thyroid condition called Graves' disease, which causes weight loss and other health problems. While he was in prison, the families of his 19 original victims went after every dollar he had ever made from telling his story. Laura Garofalo and the other relatives used a state restitution law to seize over $400,000 in royalties from his book. Roseanne Massa, the sister of his victim, Michael DeBat, summed up the pain of all the families when she said her brother had been killed once in real life and then killed again in Sammy's book. Sammy was released from federal prison in September of 2017 at age 72. He moved back to the Phoenix area where he still lives today. He is now 81 years old. He launched a YouTube channel called Sammy the Bull and a podcast called Our Thing. The channel has grown to more than 700,000 subscribers. Every week, he posts new videos talking about the murders he committed, the men he killed, and the life he lived. He makes money from the same crimes that ended other people's lives. In May of 2025, he announced that he had become a born-again Christian after recovering from a serious illness. The families of his victims continue to wonder if any version of Sammy will ever truly be sorry, or if he will simply keep talking about it for as long as people keep listening. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.